Good day, everybody. I just want to thank Julia Janes, who actually took the lead role in this project, so I might not be able to answer questions in as much detail or describe the project in as much detail. To start off with, I also want to point out that this is a community-based research in the sense that it actually started from a community organization's request for information, so part of a course-based service learning project. So the first part of the project was just to do a quick review of the literature, and long story short, there was certainly a lot of research pointing to the lack of knowledge that people have with respect to harm reduction. And also that people often just rely on their own experiences very much. In terms of gender, there's a lot of research showing that there's an increased stigma with respect to substance use for women and mothers in particular. So it's something to keep in mind. And that it can impact as well not only their substance use but their health as well. Just because there's less likelihood to go to healthcare providers for fear of stigma, and there's less openness to exchanging, their experiences with health providers. We also did a quick environmental scan and discovered that Canada's lower risk cannabis use guidelines is the one that's very often used and cited in Canada. And so we conducted a study just to find out what people think about that, of course, cannabis users. And we also wanted to get some information on people who work with women cannabis users. So we did a couple of focus groups. That wasn't enough in terms of gathering knowledge, just because it was very difficult to get people involved in these focus groups, even though we had community organizations there to support us and to help recruit people. So we did an online survey, and that got us a little more, but one of the findings, I guess, is that the numbers were actually quite low with respect to participation. And of course, keep in mind that for women, there's a greater stigma associated, and that probably affected recruitment, particularly of mothers, which we didn't find any. So no mothers actually came forward and said, yeah, sure, I'll be part of your focus group. So this is the guidelines. Probably most of you have already seen it. And so we'll get straight into the results. So the participants, these are some of their reflections that they want to point out that cannabis itself can be a harm reduction, a tool for harm reduction for people who are or were addicted to substances that have greater damage, like cocaine or heroin. A lot of people use it to reduce pain and different kinds of pain as well. And certainly one of the observations that people made with respect to harm reduction in general is that it's less stigmatizing after legalization. And they also feel like it's safer as well because they're getting it from a source that's already being inspected. And there's something about spraying on leaves. So I don't know as much about that particular tendency. In terms of the guideline, overall, the women who use cannabis didn't find it particularly useful. They also found some words like synthetic hard to understand. And so one of the quotes is, the people who can do that are not the people who probably need to smoke it to help them every day, in response to this one saying, well, don't smoke it every day. So they felt that was stigmatizing, among other things. They also mentioned that they would have liked to seen more information in terms of harm reduction. So there's gaps with respect to the information on strength of products and how to determine the strength of products and and certainly about prescribed cannabis. The workers actually had the strongest negative reaction to the guidelines, so they felt that it was, in harm reduction, it's important to be person first, to do relationship building. So when we talk about harm reduction, they do a lot of harm reduction. They're basically the frontline workers in harm reduction. And that's one of the things that they talked about. Whereas when we looked at the guidelines, they felt that they were ineffective. They promoted a message of abstinence in a tone that felt judgmental and paternalistic. And so some of the quotes are there. People with addictions have lost their ability to choose, that it's a shaming tool. It reflects old school pre-legalization attitudes towards cannabis use. I should point out actually that the frontline workers or the organization that was recruited or helping us with our recruitment is The Gathering Place, which is services for houseless individuals. So we're talking about cannabis users that many of whom struggle with houselessness issues, and their workers as well. And they actually even had concerns about having this as a broad project, that it actually would amplify people's negative attitudes towards cannabis users and women in particular, the way it was phrased. So they had particularly negative views. So the online survey is something that we brought in later just because we wanted more focus groups. We couldn't find more focus groups. We wanted mothers to answer, and mothers weren't answering. So we did an online survey, and we found that there were similarities in their understanding of harm reduction, taking an intersectional lens, meeting people where they are. So it's very similar to actually what a lot of the harm reduction workers or the frontline workers were saying. And their opinions were divided, but I would say generally more positive than the other groups. So they had certain positive reactions, but they also felt that it was stigmatizing and unhelpful as well. So some respondents said the word "don't" is not very harm reduction focused. Telling someone not to do something does not reduce risks, instead it shames and ostracizes. So we see a lot of the similar messages from the online survey as well. We tried to evaluate quantitatively their reaction to each individual guideline. So you can see that the first one is one that really they don't feel is appropriate, whereas some of the other ones, they're probably seen as more helpful than not useful. And then when we get again to the try to limit your use as possible and avoid combining any of the risky behaviors described above, they felt there's a much more judgmental tone and didn't see it as useful. I'm doing really well, actually, because I'm getting towards the end. But I should stretch it out or slow down, because I don't want to answer any questions. But we'll see what I can do. So it does give us an idea, that some of them are more about information. And I think, if anything, they'd want a guideline that would allow us to go deeper into the substantive information rather than the messages of like, well, you just don't do it and you won't have any problems, which substance users find is problematic. So, long story short, in terms of harm reduction, they highlight the need to explore the benefits while reducing harms associated with cannabis. They feel like there's not enough research on the benefits, as we've noticed already this morning, so that's nothing new. And more research on the possibilities of cannabis as a harm reduction strategy, and certainly the harm reduction benefits of legalizing cannabis was noted as well by the respondents. In terms of the guidelines, there were all had critiques basically. The online respondents were probably the most positive. The tone was considered judgmental, shaming, foregrounding abstinence, undermines self-determination, and risks for further stigmatizing women who use cannabis. In the guideline, it said that it's targeted to recreational users, which is fine, but it is intended for a broad audience. And I think that's, mainly the problem here. So given that 73% of cannabis for medical purpose users they don't have a prescription, they're just using it for their own medical needs. When you have a broad advertisement or a broad guidelines, well, it's going to be, going to all of these groups. And so, might be somewhat useful for some, but stigmatizing for others, and that is a bit of a problem. So in terms of conclusions, harm reduction is defined as minimizing the health, social, and legal impacts associated with drug use, policies, and laws. Harm reduction documents destined for cannabis users need to work towards these objectives, of course. But based on the results of this study, our conclusion is that the guidelines are not achieving this. They're negatively viewed by users and allied professionals in advocating abstinence, and they seem to be mostly destined for non-users or might-be users. Canada has taken an important step in harm reduction by legalizing cannabis, but now the priority is working towards harm reduction strategies that effectively target cannabis users, particularly women and mothers who use cannabis, as these groups face intense stigma. That's it.
All right.
And I might not have any time for a question. No, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. A question specifically about the mothers, the mother piece that you didn't capture in your data. If you were kind of to have a do-over, do you have any ideas of how you could incorporate that better? I specifically think that, there's lots of concerns about CSSD involvement and anonymity and how you kind of capture that without, in a safe way. So yeah.
I would think the only way that I can think of right at the top of my head, again, I'm not the lead on this study, is to use people with lived experience and that they would go out in the community. And so there would be this greater feeling of anonymity. But it is funny because the online surveys still, it's anonymous, but we still didn't get any. So I think there's a feeling of not wanting to share, even when you feel perfectly comfortable, even when you know it's anonymous, they just don't feel comfortable sharing and talking. So it almost seems like you need to start with the intervention before the research, that you start with the groups. We're going to have this group and we're going to make it so that it's going to be completely anonymous. And that way you'll be able to answer your questions or ask your questions, and you'll be able to chat with people who are also mothers who use cannabis. And I think sometimes you have to kind of go in reverse. This would be probably one of those times. Unfortunately, it's too late for us because the money's gone. Yes.
Thanks a lot for that presentation. I gave a talk once in a high school, and as part of my talk at the end, I also presented a little bit of the statements, and most of the students were not familiar at all with the guidelines or those statements. And those that are familiar, as you pointed out, tend to have a negative reaction to them. So as part of this study, did you ask how those guidelines could be improved?
Well, certainly, the main things are to really look at the language and the messages that you're giving. So particularly if you're targeting cannabis users, you don't need messages like, well, you shouldn't be using. If you didn't use, you wouldn't have any problems and everything would be fine. And that's what comes across in these guidelines. So really, I think the wording is the number one thing. You can certainly have the same messages or similar messages without making people feel like, oh, well, you're just, why do I need to talk to you? You're just obviously self-destroying. So I think, number one is that. And then the other thing I think that came out is they want more information, particularly on the benefits of cannabis and, if there's benefits for the particular thing, or is there evidence of benefits for the particular reasons that are using cannabis in the first place. So it also starts with, I think, researching what cannabis users want to research and not what Health Canada wants to research.
I have a question. I don't know if there's another question.
Oh, there
Nana,
we
go ahead. No, please.
Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, we just have one.
Yeah, she can go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to know, because this is in line, like in one of the studies that we're planning to do to look at the benefits as well, but I'm very curious to know, for the participants you recruited, were there any other comorbidities reported, like for the people that use that, specifically for the medical use, prescribed or non-prescribed?
There's definitely comorbidity with respect to some people, several mentioned that they're using it to control their other addictions. And so there's definitely a comorbidity in some of the participants, but it wasn't the objective, and we didn't ask questions about comorbidity. We really wanted their perceptions, and so it was just a, do you use cannabis? Are you a supporter? Those were the exclusion criteria. And then after that, we didn't ask about their usage or anything like that, no.
Okay, thank you. Can we hold off, Renato, till break? Thank you very much. Or thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.